Before we start, let's do some review. So let's open up Top Hat if you have it ready. A little review from Wednesday. Put these organs in order in the order that they're released in their hormonal axis. So when you activate these organs, and remember that thing with the general adaptations syndrome and the acute stress response. So what's the order that these organs are activated? Right, so let's see the responses. The responses are like this, most popular order, and that is the correct order. Next question. So how about this axis? Here we have the pituitary gland and hypothalamus again, but now we have the thyroid gland. Alright, let's see the responses. Most popular order is hypothalamus, pituitary, thyroid. And yes, this is the HPT axis. That's the correct order. And final review question before we start our lecture. How about these organs? Again, we have the hypothalamus, pituitary gland again, and now we have gonads. So the female gonads are ovaries and the male gonads are testes. Alright, so let's see the responses, and this is most popular order, and you got it correct again. Yes, so it's hypothalamus, pituitary, and then the target organ. So that's what we see with pituitary control and the anterior pituitary. Keep your top hat open. We will get to it later on in this lecture. Alright, so we're going to continue on with the pituitary gland and the endocrine system. So we talked to an extent about the posterior pituitary lobe and the hormones that are controlled by that or secreted by the posterior pituitary. So there are two main lobes to the human pituitary gland, the anterior lobe and posterior lobe. Now the posterior lobe, so remember that you have this blood supply to the pituitary gland, and in the posterior lobe you have these neurons that secrete hormones directly into the bloodstream, and these hormones are carried to the rest of the body. Now the two posterior pituitary hormones we covered, those are ADH and oxytocin. And if you don't know what those are, go back to my previous lectures. They're on YouTube. Alright, so then now let's switch to the anterior lobe, and this is why I kind of have another lecture on this because it's a little more complex than the posterior lobe, as you saw from those hormonal axes. So you have your own a different blood supply. So you have blood supply to both lobes, but notice that it's going on a different path. Instead of going on the inferior hypophyseal artery, it's going through the superior hypophyseal artery. So arteries are carrying blood to this anterior lobe, and then carrying these hormones from the hypothalamus down to the anterior lobe. And it's through these special veins called portal veins. These carry this category of hormones we call releasing hormones to these special endocrine cells in the anterior pituitary. And then these release yet another wave of hormones that are carried to the rest of the body via these hypophyseal veins. Alright, so then there is a difference in this hypothalamic control. Even though they're part of the same gland, notice that we see some differences in the anterior and posterior blood flow, and also just how things are controlled. So you have different blood supplies. So you have the superior hypophyseal artery in the anterior lobe, whereas you have the inferior hypophyseal artery in the posterior lobe. Now these portal vessels are in the anterior lobe, and they're carrying hormones from the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland. Whereas the posterior, you don't really have that. You have the nerves running from the hypothalamus, but they're secreting directly to blood vessels in the posterior lobe. Now the thing is that the anterior lobe, these releasing hormones, these are special hormones that are secreted by the hypothalamus, but they target cells in the anterior pituitary lobe. Whereas posterior lobe, you have the neurons secreting these hormones and chemicals directly into the bloodstream. And then this is interesting. So not the difference between yet another difference between the anterior and posterior lobe. You have a second wave being released by endocrine cells in the anterior lobe. Whereas the posterior lobe, you don't have a second wave. That the hormones are secreted by those neurons in the posterior lobe. Those are the final hormones. That ADH and oxytocin, that goes straight to the rest of the body to carry out their functions.